So now let's start to think about the mechanisms of adaptation. In other words, we're going to get now into the models of training. Well, to do this, we're going to go right the way back to 1950, and this is from Sale, and a paper that was published in the British Medical Journal, and it's so fundamentally important to us in terms of understanding how we evoke biological adaptation, how we connect those two key parameters that we've already alluded to. Fatigue, remember that we said that if fatigue is raised, then the greater the stress that's applied. And then recovery. Remember that Costel stated it's only in the recovery that you get the biological adaptation. And so what he wrote was this. The keynote of this unification was the tenet that all living organisms can respond to stress as such, and that in this respect, the basic reaction pattern is always the same, irrespective of the agent used to produce stress. We, that is they, call this response the general adaptation syndrome, and its derailments the diseases of adaptation. So I've been using the term stress. I've been saying, well, you're applying stress to get biological adaptation. We obviously get different forms of stress. You get emotional stress, you get biological stress, you get physiological stress. But what they're arguing is that you get a reaction. We always get a reaction to stress. And they write this. Anything that causes stress endangers life unless it is met by adequate adaptive responses. So, conversely, anything that endangers life causes stress and adaptive responses. Adaptability and resistance to stress are fundamental prerequisites for life, and every vital organ and function participates in them. Okay? So if anything that causes stress endangers life unless it is met by adequate adaptive responses, anything that endangers life causes stress and adaptive responses. So the notion of adaptation, we've been referring to biological adaptation, is linked to this ability to resist stress. The stress is fatigue. It's you apply the training session, you put a stress on the body because you're going to go beyond the homeostatic baseline for the individual. You do that by applying fatigue. And so only by doing that do we actually improve the health of our organs and our function and our human biological function. Now, if we come a little bit further forward, so this is kind of a paper published in 2018, and they're kind of reviewing a little bit Sale's work from the 50s, but they write this. Sale first proposed the general adaptation syndrome to describe his observations of a systemic three-phase response consisting of what they called the alarm reaction, the stage of resistance, and the stage of exhaustion. To, in their case, diverse noxious agents. And in fact, what they were doing is they were looking at what happens when people breathe at excess levels of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, for example. They were looking at kind of the way we've got biological responses. They are stressors. He, that is Sale, integrated established concepts regarding the stress response, including Claude Bernard's milieu interieur and Walter B. Cannon's homeostasis to provide a unifying model of stress and adaptation. So in other words, don't worry necessarily about Claude Bernard's stuff, but fundamentally, the homeostasis is the key thing here. That Sale recognised how fundamentally important homeostasis is and going beyond homeostasis to drive adaptation. And again, in a paper published fairly recently in 2017, the authors write this. Interestingly, Sale observed a similar phenomenon in all conditions. So whether it's gastrointestinal ulceration, thyrolymphatic atrophy, adrenocortical ulceration. In fact, the three stages of the gas, the alarm reaction, the resistance, and the exhaustion, were developed based on observed tissue changes, mainly thymus involution and adrenal hyperplasia, which occurred during persistent treatment with damaging agents. In other words, they evoked a stress-based response. Sale also found that pre-treatments, 1/4 of the alarming toxin dose of different agents, adrenaline, atropine, morphine, cold, and exercise, administered followed by a full alarming dose of the same stimuli, appeared to have a protective effect against a toxic dose of that agent. So what are they getting at? What do they mean? Well, the author's gone to perhaps bring this to the fore for us. These experiments showed that one, specificity of adaptation appears to be important as pre-treatment with the given stimulus was necessary to prevent thymus involution. So they're using the thymus as their example here. Two, an organism appears to possess a finite amount of adaptation energy, as adaptation to a certain stimulus appears to decrease resistance to other stimulus. What do we think that is? What does that sound like to us? It sounds like the law of accommodation. This concept of adaptation energy is best described by Sale as he explains. Anything to which adaptation is possible eventually results in exhaustion, that is the loss of power to resist. So where does this all fit in terms of training? Well, here we see it. So what we've got is we've got our schematic here. They've got a baseline value here, or a baseline marker. Well, replace baseline and call that homeostasis. So it's homeostasis. Now what we've got is we're going to look at this in terms of training. So this is our baseline, and these are the three conditions that Sale talked about: the alarm reaction, the resistance, and the exhaustion. And then we've got the level of adaptation on this y-axis here. So we apply our training stimulus. And because we apply the training stimulus, we get an acute response, which is the alarm reaction phase. And what happens is suddenly the level of adaptation, we get this kind of negative response. We get a reaction. What is happening? Well, it's fatigue. We're invoking fatigue. We're working beyond homeostasis. So this is where you've got to think of that about this slightly in reverse. We're going beyond homeostasis, and the further we go beyond the homeostatic level, the greater the fatigue is. Then what starts to happen is you see the curve starts to inflect here, and it's what they call transmutation. And this is where we move from what Sale referred to as the alarm reaction phase into the resistance phase. This is recovery. So remember that Kostel referred to the notion of recovery. Now what starts to happen is that fatigue that we've invoked, all this area here, starts to dissipate. But, as Sale suggested, with any noxious agent, any toxin, and also with exercise, because you've pushed beyond the homeostatic level, you get that kind of biological adaptation that we were referring to. You get a resistance. And suddenly you get this adaptive response. So this now is way beyond the baseline level. Way beyond. Now what starts to happen is we start to, in essence, lose this response. It starts to decline. And we end up back at baseline, and they're predicting you in essence can kind of get this effect here, which is overtraining, which we'll come to in a subsequent session. But this is really important. It's telling us that if we apply fatigue here, and we have the recovery, we allow for this phase that they're calling transmutation, which brings us from the alarm reaction that Sale originally called it into this resistant phase, we shift homeostasis from this level to this level here. That is the process of biological adaptation. We've gained all of this area in excess of the homeostatic level for that system, whether it be cellular, morphological, or whatever it is. And so Sale was absolutely spot on. Sale's theory, the general adaptation syndrome, was absolutely correct. what we've done within exercise science is we've taken that, as you can see here, taking his phases, and we're just applying it into a sport exercise science setting, and it fits our model in terms of adaptation very, very neatly. So what we have here now is his adaptation syndrome. So here we've got the original performance levels. This is kind of baseline. We apply the training stimulus, so we're now into alarm phase. Okay, so in the alarm phase, we have that kind of fatiguing effect. We would then go take away the training, we start to recover, and we get back to this kind of, we go beyond homeostasis, and we get to this point as we saw in the previous schematic. In example B, notice the difference now. We've gone way, way, way beyond homeostasis. The fatigue area is far, far greater. So we can get either to exhaustion, or what they're referring to as overtraining. But what we are getting is also, if we then stop the stimulus, look at the degree of adaptation, the resistance, or Sale call it resistance, we're calling it adaptation, but look at the gain, far, far greater to a new level of performance. So it really reinforces what Sale was telling us and what we've connected from earlier on in this presentation, which is fatigue drives resistance or adaptation. But you need the recovery in order for that resistance and adaptation to occur. But it's also worth noting that if you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, you will reach what Sale called exhaustion, what we would really call overtraining or underperformance syndrome. So it's a very, very fine balancing act, but it really does show us how absolutely correct Sale was in terms of his understanding of applying a stress, in our case training, in his case he was using biological noxious chemical agents, getting a response, that's the alarm phase, and they're getting a resistance, which is the adaptation to that stress.